Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to another FS Club webinar. And today I'm delighted to have Duncan Sands, whom I've known for many years, dialing in from Atlanta, of all places, to talk to us about cooperation, the evolving payments landscape. And he does so coming from being chairman of P20, Payments 20, but more of that in a moment. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm the executive chairman of CN Group, and it's my privilege to be hosting a series of webinars both before and during lockdown, and hopefully after. But I must start by thanking our sponsors. Without our sponsors, there is no way that we could achieve the things that we're allowed to do. And one of the things I admire most is their tolerance, allowing us to range widely and freely across technology, finance, and various social purposes. Thanks to all of them. And of course, in the payments arena, we of course do hit a sweet spot where many of our sponsors are deeply involved in payments, either doing payments directly or providing the technologies that support payments. Today's agenda, as ever, is my job is to get out of the way and to let you hear directly from Duncan. But after my introduction, Duncan will be speaking for about 20 to 25 minutes, and we've therefore got 15 to 20 minutes for good questions. Duncan is a truly acknowledged expert on the global payment space, and I'm sure that many in the audience would like to address questions to him. So, Duncan, with no further ado, if I might, I'd like to hand over to you to talk about cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thank you for the opportunity to talk today about payments, about P20 and what we're doing. Everyone seems to want to be involved in payments today because most activity involves a payment. And in the last few years, we've seen numerous new entrants that have launched innovative products challenging the traditional providers. And the landscape has really changed beyond recognition to the point that it is no longer sensible, nor is it desirable not to consider payments on a global basis. And why is this? This is because people in commerce have become more global and interconnected, and the gross value, and it's something you may not know, the gross value of all cross-border payments reached an all-time high in 2018 with a value of $136 trillion. We believe that the industry needed to collaborate across borders. And this led to the birth of P20 in 2016 by a joint US and UK group. Next slide, please. So what is P20? I like to describe it as a cross between an industry association and a think tank promoting best practice. Our members are the leading industry players representing banks, networks, and processors, and also the US and UK government participate, and regulators participate as well. Because we sit at this junction, we have a convening power and bring everyone together at our annual Global Payments Conference, which we've held in London, also in Atlanta, also known in the payments world as Transaction Alley. This year we're going to have a virtual conference, and next year we'll be in New York. And we do this in order to bring everyone together and advance our agenda. Next slide, please. As we started our journey, two key factors quickly became evident. A growing recognition that issues facing the industry were global in nature. And secondly, that an acceptance that some issues are and should be non-competitive. And this realization was shared and supported by government leaders. Jack Lew encouraged P20 in its mission, and Philip Hammond saw the value in the work that P20 is doing. We believe that a payments ecosystem that is accessible, secure, and inclusive enables commercial competition to thrive in a safer environment, and that it will be for the benefit of all. But the only way to realize this is for fierce competitors to leave their swords and shields at the door to collaborate on these non-competitive issues. And this is exactly what P20 is doing. Next slide, please. Our umbrella issues are regulation, cybersecurity, and financial inclusion. And I want to discuss the broad focus we have on each area, the landscape, and the priority issues that we are tackling. Next slide. On regulation, our focus is on combating fraud and criminal transactions. The problem is more widespread than is generally known, and there is a massive and unacceptable human cost. Lives are ruined, Families are destroyed, futures are lost. And this tragedy is enabled by payments. And the slide, I think, shows some truly shocking figures which we should reflect on. But to provide some context on terrorism financing, ISIS was operated on a budget of $1 billion. And the next time you see North Korea launch a rocket, know that it wasn't financed by their tax revenues. So as an industry, we have a responsibility and crucially an ability to combat this. And P20 is providing a platform to do that. Next slide, please. But we can only do it by working together. And the FCA is a global leader on highlighting the problem and encouraging collaboration. And they themselves are a willing partner in this work. Chris Woolard's been a long-time supporter of P20. He has participated in some of our board meetings. He has been, he's addressed our conference as a keynote speaker as well. Next slide, please. It might seem like a mountain to climb, but all the criminals are doing when they move money is to use the tools that we use when we're paying bills, when we're buying something, when we're sending money to friends and family. And we're seeing a massive spike in fraud attempts at this very moment during the COVID-19 pandemic. And technology has a role to play in identifying illegal transactions. And to be successful, it also requires individual responsibility by customers and an industry determined to tackle this problem that provides customers with the tools they need to play their part. Small actions will start to yield results. And P20's first area of focus has been on payee authentication or confirmation of payee as it's known in the UK. Essentially, it's a matching service. Does the customer's intended recipient match the actual name on the account held by the bank? And informing the payer of that discrepancy gives them the opportunity to reflect on whether it is a valid payment. We're about to release our interim report on best practice in this area and an analysis of the different approaches that are taken around the world. We're now moving on more broadly to authorized payment fraud, including examining customer warning messages for online payments, which are not standardized in their approach, wording, or style. And with real-time payments coming on stream in other parts of the world, we can create a standard that is recognized and replicated internationally. Now, technology has a big role to play in two other issues that P20 is examining: criminal account targeting and mule account identification. AI can highlight transfers made by new accounts, particularly to international recipients, and divert them for additional checks. It would slow the transfer, perhaps not noticeably, but it might yield results, providing evidence to close down criminal activity. Secondly, KYC AML protocols have tightened in recent years, and the criminals have noticed this and changed their behavior accordingly. They're now using mule accounts, often students who are unaware that they're committing a criminal offense. The students paid a small sum to hand over their login details to allow transfers to be made in their name. And the advantage to the criminal is that there are no KYC AML checks for them to go through. But while the banks close thousands of mule accounts every year, there's a bigger role for them to play in both the education of students and other new account holders, and technologically by highlighting unusual activity and balances so that these avenues of opportunity can be reduced. Calibrating the message and the approach across the industry is the only way that we can be effective. Next slide, please. Turning to cybersecurity, P20 is focused on developing a unified response to a systemic attack. That means bringing down a country's payment system. As the slide shows, breaches are on the rise and data is being stolen at an alarming rate. We live in this data world where data is being generated continuously, so much so that 90% of the world's data has been generated in the last 2 years. And the criminals know this. They've professionalized their operation. They run it as a business. When they find information that they weren't expecting, they create a market for it rather than discard it. And this means that any attack that garners them any data has financial value to them. So how does it work? Next slide, please. The US Secret Service talks about the concept of the crime triangle, where a perfect storm creates criminal opportunity. The attackers aren't amateurs. In places like North Korea, people are recruited as professional cyber hackers who go to work daily. They educate themselves on a company's network and they identify the weak points. And their sophisticated approach means that they probably have a greater overall understanding than the company itself. They use this knowledge to their advantage by undermining what Michael Chertoff, the former US Homeland Security Secretary, calls unity of effort and unity of mind. This is the idea that if people's working relationships are disrupted, they will not be working together effectively, and that will be even more pronounced in a crisis. For the attacker, that means that the door is effectively ajar. Many effective leaders have talked about the importance of personal relationships and how organizations are a collection of people. Well, the bad guys understand this as well, and that's why their approach is individual and not corporate. They target individuals individually. Next slide, please. So how do we prepare and respond? How do we stop a crisis from turning into a catastrophe? Security is ultimately about time. How long do you have for detection and response? But technology has shortened time. Seconds are now milliseconds, but we can't comprehend what milliseconds are because it takes 300 milliseconds to blink an eye. But so to demonstrate how technology has made things faster, and by how much, what used to take 4 months now takes just 1 second. But beyond continuing to innovate technologically, which is a given, there are some key tasks which actually apply beyond just payments. Firstly, collaborating with peer companies and sharing threat intelligence and technical details. Using best practice to strengthen resiliency and write a response plan now, because it is best not to be writing it in a crisis. As Dwight Eisenhower said, peacetime plans are of no particular value, but peacetime planning is indispensable. Thirdly, practice. Involve everyone. Cybersecurity isn't just for cyber professionals, it's for everybody to understand, and the criminals understand that we don't really understand that. Fourthly, understand the interdependencies of your business and sector, because criminals don't care about collateral damage. And finally, approach this issue on a global basis, because the criminals don't respect borders. Next slide, please. At P20, we're providing a forum where, through collaboration, the industry can strengthen defenses, build working relationships and trust, and develop a protocol that defines the moment of crisis and how we work together in the event of a systemic attack. And this isn't an academic exercise. We hold regular tabletop exercises to practice response, communication, and collaboration in a crisis, and through this to further build trusted relationships. Why is this work important? Because payments are the lifeblood of the economy. Without them, trade and commerce ceases. Both the US and the UK consider payment systems to be critical national infrastructure, essential in a crisis such as we are enduring today. So if the payment systems fail, it calls into question what has been termed the continuity of the economy. And that is why we have to work together. Next slide, please. This leads on to P20's third priority, financial inclusion. The ability of everyone to have access to one mainstream payment method. Now, COVID-19 has exposed that someone wishing to pay with cash is left at a disadvantage, as many retail outlets are refusing cash. In the developed world, the advancement of technology has for years widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Until recently, this has been allowed to happen, but now there is a realization that it is an issue that must be addressed. Remember, there is a stark difference between the developed and developing worlds. In the developed world, technology excludes. In the developing world, technology includes. Percentage-wise, the number of people excluded from the mainstream financial system in developed countries, either by choice or circumstance, is relatively small. But is it acceptable in the 21st century just to ignore them? Next slide, please. I don't think so, nor does P20, and nor do many politicians. The story of Sweden sleepwalking into society where cash transactions represent less than 1% is a salutary lesson for the developed world. Some state and local politicians in the US have instituted rules requiring cash to be accepted by businesses that have a shop front. And there's a bipartisan bill protecting cash that's before the House of Representatives. In the UK, the issue of financial inclusion has crystallized itself in the CNE Access to Cash report about the UK's cash infrastructure and access to free ATMs. And the government's commitment to level up the regions of the UK and to boost broadband infrastructure both touch on unequal access to a growing digital economy. Access to technology needs to be horizontal, not vertical. We must eliminate the digital divide. And to give a stark example that demonstrates the urgent need to include everyone, this is something that's happening in America right now. In March, Congress passed a bill authorizing economic stimulus payments of $1,200 to every American. About 170 million people were estimated to be eligible. If the IRS has, which is the equivalent of the Inland Revenue has, or you give them your bank details, they will pay you immediately by direct deposit. If not, you wait for a check, perhaps until as late as September this year. And despite a law change that to receive benefits you needed to receive them electronically, about 9 million Americans don't have a bank account and aren't enrolled in the government's prepaid debit card program. So they still get checks for their benefits. And so it's clear to me that there's a significant number of struggling American families who need the support the most, who are still waiting to receive their money, while middle-class families have had theirs deposited directly into their bank account. And this just isn't right. Next slide, please. P20 focuses on the developed world and is examining how, without slowing down innovation, payments can be inclusive and not exacerbate exclusion. And crises put a spotlight on holes in the system, and that drives quick and sometimes substantial change. But P20 is at the forefront of contributing to the debate, not only of being inclusive now, but also of ensuring that COVID-19 doesn't become a reason to cast aside financial inclusion in the future. And we are also examining why solutions that do exist are not being utilized and recommending what changes need to be made to encourage participation. These are not competitive issues, and P20 is providing a forum for the industry to come together. Next slide, please. I want to touch briefly on COVID-19 by saying that the pandemic hasn't actually changed what it is that P20 is doing. What it has done is to put a magnifying glass on the issues that we focus on and show and really make our work more vital than it was before. Criminals have taken to heart the adage, never waste a good crisis, and have stepped up cyber attacks, sensing vulnerability in organizations with people working from home. Phishing attacks have escalated as the bad guys try to intercept the billions of dollars in government aid being dispensed to individuals and businesses. We've seen a change in individual behavior caused by necessity, and the big question is whether this will affect a long-term behavior change. I find that in my own life, that habit is a very powerful force, and as the quote on the screen says, a repeated action eventually becomes a habit. Next slide, please. But will the rise of the digital economy change behavior? Will e-commerce become people's preferred method of shopping? How can we keep everything secure? How do we ensure that everyone has access? Has experimenting with new payment methods left people wondering why they stuck with old ways for so long? And what about cash? Has COVID-19 sounded its death knell? What would that mean for the unbanked, for the most vulnerable in our society? We don't know the answers, but these are the payments issues of our time. And P20 provides a forum for the industry to collaborate on making payments accessible, affordable, and secure for all in order to create a level playing field where competition can thrive. Last slide, please. So I want to leave you with one of my favorite quotes by Theodore Roosevelt that talks about being present and active and not being silent and invisible. The quote goes on to talk about failure and perhaps success, about trying and daring greatly. And this is the mission of P20, and we would welcome you joining us on this journey. Thank you.
Duncan, that was fantastic. Swift, authoritative, and insightful. Most appreciated.
Thank you.
Anyway, well, to get cracking, and folks, use the GoToWebinar question facilities to send me questions. Do send them swiftly, though, because time passes fast, and I don't want you to run off the end. But just to get a few things going, if I might. Firstly, you mentioned the payments corridor, and I had the opportunity in 88 or 89, to actually go to Atlanta to meet Equifax, who I didn't know, and to lure them to the UK as part of my strategy. And they purchased a firm called Westpac up in Leeds, Bradford, and that's what brought them over. And it was then that I first noticed this concentration of payments industries around that belt in North Georgia. But it's only gotten stronger. Would you mind just explaining it to some of the viewers out there?
So actually, it goes all the way back to the 60s when the Federal Reserve decided that credit card processing, which was done by hand and not by computer, they decided to do the credit card processing in Atlanta. So actually, the talent pool has been there for years, which is one of the reasons why payments companies, why processors have been drawn to Atlanta over the decades. But really, I think it's only in the last 5-10 years that it's actually sort of put its head above the parapet. Now to the point that in the US, when you use your credit card, there's a 7 out of 10 chance that your payment will be processed here in Atlanta. So it really is. It's sort of a bit like a snowball going down a hill. As the visibility became more apparent, more people are drawn to it as a magnet, because this is where the talent pool lies for payments.
Well, there used to be an old joke in America that it doesn't matter when you die, you're going to go to heaven. You're going to change planes in Atlanta. So yeah. I think it's the same thing with payments. But just what are some of the major firms out there that people ought to be aware of? Because I think many of them see them as U.S. and don't realize the intense regionalism in the U.S.
Well, I mean, it's not in terms of like there's ones who are headquartered there, but I mean, people like FIS and Fiserv, they have a big presence in Atlanta. Even though they're not there, we've got NCR, Elavon is here as well.
And just a final question on that: are there any other factors other than the snowball effect of credit cards? Are there any distinguishing elements that you can think of?
Well, going back to the airport, one of the things about it's the world's busiest airport, and the connections from it are very good. But the thing about Atlanta is that it's actually within 2 hours flying time of 80% of the U.S. population. On top of that, the labor laws are fairly relaxed and fairly sort of favorable towards business. And plus the climate, despite the fact that it gets very hot here in the summer, the climate also, in terms of days lost to bad weather, is one of the lowest in the US and very consistent throughout the year.
Now, you touched on one, very important and specific particular element of fraud, which was mules, and I'm just conscious a few people in the audience might not know quite what you were referring to. Would you mind just explaining that and maybe a little bit more about what you're doing about it?
Yeah, so mule accounts are where somebody basically, if you think of it in terms of drugs and how the dealers, the drug traffickers will give drugs to somebody to take across the border to whatever its final destination is. that's really what we, when we talk about mule accounts, that's what we mean. What we mean is that someone who already has an existing account is basically just providing that sort of infrastructure, that ability to be able to send the money. And obviously, as I mentioned, it's attractive to the criminals because they don't have to go through all of the checks that they would have to do if they rolled up at the bank to open their own account themselves. Plus, also, I think that accounts that have been opened for longer may not be looked at quite as carefully. And that's really part of what the work is that we're doing, is how can the banks really sort of do a better job at educating people to understand that this type of thing might happen. In the same way that, we constantly get reminded about phishing emails, and everything like that. How can we make sure that when people open a bank account, they realize that, you can't just, send money for somebody just as you wish?
Well, that leads us on to an interesting point here. Aaron Agarwal is talking here about, in the UK and elsewhere, payment service providers are being strangled by lack of access to banking services. What can be done? What is P20 doing?
So, sorry, can you just read the question?
Sure. No. In the UK and elsewhere, payment service providers are being strangled by lack of access to banking services. What can be done? What is P20 doing?
Well, I think that I'm not sure that we're doing anything absolutely specific, on that. But I think that, again, part of, as I talked about, the convening power and the relationship building that we have, I think that that's helping to, by building those relationships, you allow people to, to move forward and do business together, whereas they might not have access or have those relationships and contact details to be able to make those changes. Mm-hmm. But certainly, it's something that what P20, by bringing everyone together, we're trying to make the system work for everybody, not just for the customers, but also for, when we talk about financial inclusion, we're also talking about financial inclusion for SMEs as well, which sometimes get excluded. Yeah.
Well, in fact, funny enough, Aaron goes on and asks, correspondent banking has been increasingly restricted to emerging market banks, causing real economic hardship. Are you on top of this one as well?
I'm not sure we're saying we're on top of it. I mean, P20 is a very small, organization, and we've really just been focused, on the three areas that we are. I think that one of the things that, we've seen, the rise of fintech has really been a great disruptor for traditional banking, and we're seeing how people are reacting, how the traditional players are reacting to this. But again, we don't want to see, exclusive relationships. We want to see things opened up, and gradually, I think that that we will. But again, I think that it's really the relationship building is so key in all of this.
Okay. Dan Fionney is asking, are there working groups for open banking and open finance, and also emerging markets in Latin America, Africa, and Asia? Do you extend in those directions?
At first, we're just looking at the developed world at the moment. It's more a capacity thing than anything else. And also because those markets in some sense are different to the developed world markets. And we don't want to. We prefer to make real progress on a smaller focus than to have a sort of thinner spread across everything.
And one viewer is sort of curious, where do you stand on China? Because that's a very different payment market, isn't it? With sort of Alibaba and Tencent being two behemoths encompassing virtually the entire market with a lot of overlap. And is China a place you don't need to engage with? Is China a place you are deeply engaged with? Is China a place you aren't engaged with, but would really, really like to when you get more capacity, as you said?
We are engaged with China. China UnionPay is one of our members of P20. It has been, it's been a slower process with them. It's partly language, partly culture, partly time difference and everything. But we do want to engage more with China, and we're hoping that through our relationship with China UnionPay, that will enable us to do so. But we've got a solid anchor that is there with China UnionPay, and they're a very valued and contributing member of P20.
Mm-hmm. And another question related to this what can we learn from China? They seem to have, when we talk about financial inclusion, they seem to have, it's not complete, but to have really gone and banked $1 billion in less than a generation, and to have some pretty sophisticated and slick systems, from advance payments down to the beggars in the street. And I myself find it interesting because as a WeChat WePay user, I wish my Western banking and payment services worked anything like that. It's just phenomenally wonderful. Any comments on that?
No, I mean, I think there's lots that we can learn, not just from China, but from everywhere. But I mean, China they have done a remarkable job. I think that, in part it might be, because of for cultural reasons, more than anything else, that they're able to roll out things much more, easily and more fully than perhaps we can elsewhere in the world. One of the interesting things that we are, looking at on financial inclusion is why, what are the barriers? Why are people not taking up existing solutions that are out there? And I think that, we could, if we can identify, because there are solutions that are out there, and if we can identify why people are not taking them up, then we might be able to get closer to the spread and participation that they have in China.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, Duncan, and quite rightly, that we've had the U.S. government COVID payments. Not very long ago, over the last year, 18 months, universal benefit has also been, without COVID, talked about in numerous countries. There was a referendum in Switzerland. There was a crescendo here in the UK. There were some American congresswomen proposing this. So it was there. I've never quite grasped it, and I'm just wondering if you got any early indications on what some of those barriers might be, because if the government was saying to me, "There's money here for you, and it's a reasonable amount, and all you have to do is sign up to a debit card or something," what is preventing it? Is it education, ignorance? Is it genuinely? I mean, these days of mobile phones, of PCs, of frankly extremely cheap iPad knockoffs, how can it be that people find it difficult to connect?
Well, I think that I think sometimes there's a very small percentage of people who don't want to be involved in any form of sort of formal banking, because they're worried about government having all their details and everything. But the people who live on the tightest budgets, on the whole, they prefer to deal with physical cash. And they worry about, they worry about banks and charges, even if there are, even if the banks tell them that you can have this without having charges, they worry that there are going to be charges that they don't know about. So I think there's I think it's partly an education issue. I think that there's a sort of general feeling, by some people that, if they use, any form of banking system, that they will somehow encounter charges that they can't afford to have at all. The other thing is that in dealing with cash, people like physical cash because they can actually see what they have, whereas they feel that it helps their their sort of budgeting and everything like that. And I think that just sort of generally, those, the people are there, they're worried that they don't have enough money to put into a bank account. So it's almost like you put it on something and it's going to go straight out. So for convenience purposes, it's easier for them just to deal in cash. But I don't think that there's ever been any proper work done to really understand, why that is the case. I think additionally more specific to the US, with a lot of undocumented people, there is a concern about engaging too much with government and giving, and I think there's just this sort of feeling that if you engage with the financial system, that you're effectively giving everything to the government as well. So there are lots of issues that are there, but I don't think we really understand it. But I'm hopeful that P20 has found a route to be able to better understand that.
Yeah, it's a somewhat justified fear of formal systems of all forms. Is not necessarily being paranoid. So it's a good point there. And are you planning on publishing some of this research soon, or?
Well, yeah, we will when the working group reach their conclusions.
Okay, good. It sounds fascinating. We'd love to have that back. I've got time for just about 4 more questions, if you don't mind. Continuing our tour around the world, honest, this is the last of the ones out there, but I think it's a great question. Rupert Wood is saying, do you see M-Pesa-style mobile payment systems spreading further outside of the developing world into the developed world? And he has a sort of supplementary question. Are they more or less vulnerable to crime?
I think that I definitely think that we will see banking change, enormously, and I think that we will see, mobiles being the way forward. I mean, there's lots of statistics out there that say that most people, when they're accessing things on the internet, that they do it through a mobile device rather than a desktop. So I think that banking often is a little bit slower at making those changes, but I think that we'll see more of that. In terms of vulnerability, I think probably it's probably less vulnerable, but again, this is, as I was making the point about, the professionalization of the criminals, of the hackers. As I said, in North Korea and in other countries as well, they employ people. I mean, they put out a job advert to train people to be professional hackers. So whilst I could say today that I think that, that mobiles are probably safer and more secure, this is, it's an escalator, sort of going up and down escalator. We've just got to continue to innovate, to stay ahead and keep up, with what they're doing.
Yeah. When you said that earlier on, you put in my mind this idea of a besuited gentleman heading to his North Korean office with his briefcase in hand, and coming home that night. Hi, honey, I'm home. An extra chicken for the pot. I drained some granny's bank account, so I've got a bonus. It's kind of the normality of it. Yeah.
I mean, a very senior cybersecurity official in a government told me. He said it's very disconcerting to me still that I know that my counterpart is also going to work like I am every day, but he's trying to attack me.
Yeah. Oh, well. Now, there's a question here from Bob McDowell. Bob's got 2 questions I'd like to ask you. The first one, I normally like to think I know the question, but I'll just throw it at you as is. Extending account relationships enables aggregating and netting payments. How great does this impact the commerciality of transaction flows?
That's an interesting one. I mean, I think it does. I'm just trying to think on the top of my head as to, maybe I can reply to this one outside of.
Yeah, I'll make sure you get Bob's details. Bob asked another one, which I do get completely, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts. Sanctions are a political tool, particularly with you dialing in from America. Sanctions are a political tool which feeds into constraints on payment systems and are likely to grow such that any payment system is conflicted. How big a challenge is this to the P20?
No, I mean, I think, sanctions are, they are a tool which do affect us. And it affects us because the world has become more interconnected. Again, I think that I keep on going back to it, but I think that the relationship building and the relationship building between industry and government is so important, because I think, again, it's very easy for people not to fully understand. It's easy for a politician or an official to think, well, we need to do sanctions, but not to understand what the knock-on effect of that is. And I think that having that involvement, that participation, support of people in government helps them understand that, if you make a decision on something, it might have some unintended consequences which you haven't thought of, even though you get the headline the next day that the politician was looking for.
And finally, really, I'd like to ask you a closing comment from you on. You made, I thought, a very intriguing point in your presentation about, in the developing world, technology is about inclusion, and in the developed world, technology appears to be about exclusion. Could you just expand on that a little bit and what it might mean for the P20?
Yeah, so it's really what it comes down to is infrastructure. So obviously, in the developed world, infrastructure is very good. So it's very easy for people to get access to banking services and everything on a physical basis. It's very easy for them to get access to cash. But if you're in the developing world and you're in a very rural location, the idea of being able to go to a physical bank to make a payment or to withdraw cash or whatever could be something that's quite some distance away, because the infrastructure isn't there. I think that there's a lot that we can learn, that the developed world can learn from the developing world. But I think the reason I said what I did was that in the developing world, technology brings that infrastructure closer to the people. Whereas in the developed world, one of the things that we've seen, we've seen the reduction in ATMs, particularly in free ATMs. We've seen the closure of bank branches and everything as more people move into the digital economy, onto online transactions. And so that's why. So it's actually taking that infrastructure further away. So if you live in a rural village somewhere, say in England, you might have to travel further than you used to to get to a bank branch, because your bank closed down. So it's a sort of it's an opposite effect. But I think that we have to, what's happening in Sweden, when somebody put it to me that the regulators were a little bit asleep at the wheel. They now find themselves in a situation where it really, it has got pretty acute with just less than 1% of transactions carried out in cash.
Which I guess brings us back really to the title of your talk, cooperation. How can we encourage people to compete and cooperate? Because financial inclusion is going to require cooperation as much as it requires competition. Yeah, it's a very good point.
No, I think it's absolutely necessary that everybody, these are big questions to create that landscape that is a level playing field, and that's where competition can thrive. And the only way that we can do that is by through collaboration on these non-competitive issues. Very and that's what we're trying to do.
Duncan, it's been wonderful to have you. Really, it has. I'll come back and thank you properly in a minute. But if I could,
thank you very much.
I want to thank our sponsors again for allowing us to range widely. But I hope many of them felt that today's talk was pretty much in their sweet spot, where technology meets finance for a social purpose, particularly areas like financial inclusion and protecting against cyber attacks. So all excellent stuff. And I'd like to thank our audience. We'd like to welcome you back. Tomorrow we have Jim Briding, Jim, I've known slightly longer than Duncan, since the mid-70s of all times. Jim wrote a fascinating book called Made in Switzerland and has brought out a sequel called The S8, The Small Eight Nations, and he's going to explore what makes them great. And I think particularly at a time of the EU under stress, with Brexit offering us opportunities, it's a good time to look around for some lessons we might pick up. This will be covering countries such as Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Ireland, Israel, etc. So it'll be well worth listening to tomorrow. And we have a Financial Center focus on Casablanca coming up on Thursday, and finally on Friday, a really interesting session on what COVID-19 might mean to the workplace, with some extremely deep research from Victoria Ward and her colleagues. So all worth watching. More at it every day, as ever. Just check out the website. But Duncan, I'd like to turn to you, if I may. You'll win many awards: authoritative, precise, incisive, and early, even better than on time. You'll also probably win our award for the best backdrop. I understand that's done by your aunt, Edwina Sands. Is that correct?
That is right, yes.
It is gorgeous.
Yes.
It really looks lovely.
Thank you.
So that's there. But Duncan, most of all, thanks to you. You really gave us a real insight on what it's like at the core of the payments corridor and elsewhere around the world. And we wish you and the team at P20 every success on what are very noble, laudable, and you make them sound achievable objectives. So thank you so much. And I'm afraid in this day of COVID-19 and the way that webinars work, all I can offer you by way of thanks online just now is a hearty round of applause from me. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for having me.
Oh, great. Hope to have you back.